Hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk about Aristotle. Aristotle, Greek philosopher, who lived from 384 to 322 BC. He was a student of Plato, who studied at Plato's Academy for 19 years and studied subjects that ranged from logic, astronomy, ethics, rhetoric, poetics. Was really a polymath as a philosopher, arguably the greatest philosopher that ever lived for breadth and depth of thought. And today I wanted to talk about his ethics. He wrote a book called The Nicomachean Ethics. He either dedicated it to his father, a physician named Nicomachus, or to his son named Nicomachus. We're not sure, but it's called The Nicomachean Ethics. It's 10 books, some 300 pages, and it's just one of several of Aristotle's masterworks. Remember, this is the person who systematized the rules for logic. If he had done that alone, that would qualify him as the greatest philosopher that ever lived, but he wrote the poetics, the rhetoric, metaphysics, political philosophy, and there is no stone unturned with Aristotle. So, his ethics is teleological, and teleological means that the word telos in Greek means end. So the ethics are something that exists for some goal or purpose. They tend towards, all human activity tends towards some goal or purpose. And every art and every inquiry, he starts out, the first sentence of the Nicomachean Ethics tends towards some end. And so a good action, according to Aristotle, is an action that, a good life, a good action, not just a good action, but an entire good life, is one that tends towards a worthy end and has a purpose. Eudaimonia means that the first part of the word EU means good, as in euthanasia or eugenics, and daimon means spirit, so a good spiritedness or well-being, something we've talked about, is what characterizes a happy life. Now in the first book of the Ethics, I'm not going to go through each of the 10 books, but in the first book he talks about what this happy life might be, because he says people agree that the good life is the happy life, but they don't agree on what constitutes happiness. So he goes into pleasurable life. Is it pleasure that we equate with happiness? And he says, no, pleasure is too ephemeral. I get pleasure from eating or drinking, and these sorts of pleasures arise, but they come and go. And he says in the first book, one swallow does not a summer make. And so there's something that has to be more sustained than the pleasure. Pleasure may accompany a good life, but it's not the purpose that he has in mind. He also considers the life of honor. This is the life of a statesman, the person who seeks honor from others, someone who wants to be elected. He quickly dismisses that as the good life, because he thinks in order to attain that kind of happy life, one depends upon others. And the good life should be something that you can get by yourself. A person running for office needs the votes of others, and the approval of others can be fickle. Many examples of that are someone who led early on in a campaign and later on fell like a stone when they discovered that he was limited in some way, or she was limited in some way. So then what does he settle on as the happy life? The happy life is the life of virtue. And the life of virtue is having a virtue is a disposition to do a good action, and a good action is in the mean, this is a mathematical term, lying between two extremes, extremes of excess and extremes of deficiency. Let me give you an illustration. If we're talking about courage, you can be excessively courageous, and this is called foolhardy or rash. Someone who has too much to prove, wants to take chances, maybe goes drag racing or bungee jumping when conditions are not safe, or takes selfies of themselves while sitting on a cliff. This is not a good thing to do. It may fool the casual observer into thinking, oh, look at how courageous that person is. But according to Aristotle, that's not the genuine article, because it's just excessive, it's foolhardy. So it tends towards the right end of the spectrum, if you can picture a spectrum of an action that's deficient in courage, one that has just the right amount, and so is courageous, and one is excessive or foolhardy. On the other end of that spectrum is someone who's deficient in courage, someone who can face no difficulty. Perhaps they have a fear of battle, and they are always run from danger. It's bad to be foolhardy in battle, Aristotle says. If you're one person against 10, you shouldn't advance. Perhaps you should retreat. But you shouldn't be fearful either. and he's not just talking about the courage involved in battles, but often he does. If you can't withstand the threat of pain, or you can't withstand the beckoning of pleasure, if you can't, that emotion that overcomes the person, and if you can't withstand that emotion, then in fact then you're fearful. He says the emotion itself isn't bad, but it has to be controlled. And so the person who's deficient in courage, because we call them cowardly, the person who has just the right amount is courageous. And this is his, he didn't call it this, but it came to be known as the doctrine of the golden mean. It was, if you think of a mean in numbers, 1 and 11, the mean would be 6. It's midway between 1 and 11. It's also, if you add 1 and 11, divide by 2, you get 6. So it's a mathematical term, and we're probably used to the word mean coming up there more than anything. But here, Aristotle employs this mathematical template that he imposes on the virtues. He has 11 virtues. His teacher Plato had 4 core or cardinal virtues, including wisdom and self-control. Aristotle extends the list to 11, and he systematizes the virtues, as I like to put it, because he says that they have this. Someone can do something excessively, something can do something deficiently, or just the right amount. So the life of virtue turns out to be the means to the end of happiness. Happiness is the end goal of life. It's, as Aristotle says, final and self-sufficient. But the virtues are not only good in themselves, good to have courage, good to have self-control, good to be generous, good to be just, he says, but they're also a means to the end of happiness. And if you don't have them, happiness becomes a more difficult proposition. A person who, for example, lacks self-control, Aristotle calls that person the morally weak man, or the akrates, A-K-R-A-T-E-S is the Greek word. A person who knows the good, knows that they shouldn't have this cigarette because they know the cigarette is carcinogenic, but they have it anyway. They give in. They're overcome by passion, Aristotle says, so the knowledge is overwhelmed by emotion, and this is moral weakness. On the other hand, the morally strong person has the virtue, the enkrates, E-N-K-R-A-T-E-S. This person has the disposition towards virtue. It's been firmly established in their character by repetition. Aristotle has this famous line, he's full of famous lines, but excellence as a habit might be the most famous of all. You see this on bumper stickers, high school football coaches quote it, that you establish a habit, a good habit over time, just the way I like to quote it, it's like the moral muscle theory. You don't build the muscle with one trip to the gym. You build it by repetition of lifting the weights and right living. And so too, the virtue is not built by one action. If you jump into the deep end of the swimming pool to save someone who's flailing about and hollering, just doing that action and saving them once, Aristotle would say, does not establish that you have the virtue. But if you face difficult situations and you act courageously over time, if you have the habit, the Greek word is hexis, if you have this disposition that's formed, then you have the virtue of courage. So it's best to have as I say, the virtues are good in and of themselves. They're good as a means to an end. And the happy life is what he has in mind here. As it turns out, when you get to Book 10 of his Ethics, he does, in some scholars' minds, an about-face, because he then talks about the life of contemplation. Now, has he contradicted himself here? Has he said that he was talking all along about the virtuous life, which is an active life? It could be the life of someone in politics, someone in business, someone in their personal life can exhibit virtue. So what is he doing at the last minute, talking about the contemplative life? He happens to think that at the end of life, when the active life becomes, if not impossible, more difficult, or you can't be a person of activity, that a life of contemplation is the right life. You'll see this in several religions. In Hinduism, for example, the person leaves civilization, turns their back, and it pursues moksha, M-O-K-S-H-A, liberation. So Aristotle has this idea of contemplation, and this is contemplation. The highest thing to do is contemplation, he says. It's even higher than the life of virtue, because you're most like God, he says, when you're contemplating. And in fact, what is God doing? God, according to Aristotle, is thinking about his own thinking. God is noosing, or thought thinking, according to Aristotle. And so Aristotle's God is thinking about metaphysics and mathematics and higher things, not concerned about the affairs of this world, wars and plagues. They're beneath his attention. He's focused on the highest things, and so you become God-like yourself when you contemplate, Aristotle thinks. I don't think of this as a contradiction. I think of it as just a different direction you take at the end of your life. He hasn't said that the life of virtue was the sole life of goodness. He says that is a way, it's a means to the end of a happy life. But Aristotle there's much more in it than I've said here. I wanted to point out one thing that's a source of controversy. He thinks there is such a thing as moral weakness, as I said. He says that you can know the good. I can know these sweets. He has what he calls the pragmatic syllogism, and the practical syllogism goes that all sweets are bad. This is a sweet, therefore this is bad. I should not have it. And yet the person has the sweet anyway. So Aristotle again calls that weakness of will. It's kind of moral backsliding. You know the good but fail to do the good. Socrates, who came before Aristotle, thought that such a thing was impossible. Socrates, remember, held the doctrine that knowledge is virtue. If I know the good, then I really will do the good. If I know that cigar is bad for me, then I won't have the cigar, Socrates says. Aristotle seems to have the better of this argument, because we know lots of cases where people know what is right to do but fail to do it, or know what is wrong to do but do it anyway, conversely. So, but not so fast. Socrates' reply would be, if he were to speak to Aristotle, he didn't, he died in 399 BC, 15 years rather before Aristotle was born, but if he were to speak to Aristotle, he said the person who does have the tobacco, knowing that it's bad, really didn't have full knowledge. That is to say, they mistook their short-term good for their long-term good. So there'll be this controversy between Aristotle and Socrates if we were to pair them together and they would have this discussion. On the surface, it appears that Aristotle is correct. Aristotle's an empiricist, and he thinks that these things are empirically true, that people do in fact act this way. But Socrates, again, has a different notion of what knowledge is than Aristotle. So it would be an interesting debate were it to play out between the two of them. And so scholars, since they can't do it themselves, scholars play it out instead. So I've enjoyed talking to you about Aristotle today, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.